there's anything that you guys didn't get to talk about in your presentation you want to mention.
Okay, we're back from the stream now, and thank you very much. We're going to resume with the questioning, and hopefully now we have some, the sync is a little bit better. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you if you have a question.
So I have a question for Dan. This is from Handle Weather Media. And his question is, was the pattern different from the 2001 to 2002 setup and the 2011 and 2012 setup for winter?
Oh, you're testing my memory here. 10 years ago, huh? 2001, 2002. I want to say it was similar. I mean, that was a pretty warm year overall. We did have a positive NAO that year, I believe. But honestly, it's going to be tough. I don't have anything in front of me here. I can't really speak specifically to this. But I will say this, just as a point of reference. This is probably one of the most positive NAO years that we've ever had so far for a winter. That's something to take away. So I'm not a huge fan of looking at analog years. I know this is the second question where we sort of talk about like comparisons to previous years. What can we deduce from that? There's always comparisons to previous years, but you can never look at 2 years and say, oh, these 2 years are identical. There's never a good comparison there. I'm not a huge fan of using the analogs. And you can look at it in the short range too. No two storms are ever alike either. A lot of forecasters will try to do that. Oh, this storm looks a lot like the storm we had 3 years ago, but it's never going to play out exactly the same way. You can do the same thing with seasonal forecasting. So it looks a lot like it did in 2001, 2002, but it's not exactly the same. And even though a lot of the parameters look similar, it never happens exactly the way we expect it if we use analogs alone. So for that reason alone, I don't love the whole analog thing and using that as a forecasting tool for seasons to come. So.
There's one question here for Dr. Forbes. Dr. Forbes, you've had such a distinguished career as a professor and now at the Weather Channel. What's next?
Well, hopefully I'm going to continue at the Weather Channel for quite some time until I get to retirement age, but that's certainly my plan. But if things change, I'll deal with it.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay, they would like to mute me sometimes. This is from Jonathan Bauer in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and this is for Dr. Forbes. What are your thoughts on historical long-track tornadoes? Do you think there's a chance for similar, like the tri-state event? Do you see this being a more common occurrence in the future?
Wow, the tri-state event is, for those of you that not so much familiar with that, that is the longest tornado track on record in the United States. It's been confirmed and has in fact, it was 219 miles in the original, and some of the veteran meteorologists, some in attendance even at this conference here, have been studying, going back and doing some interviews of some of the residents, even in some of the adjacent areas, and they're about to publish. They may find it was even a little bit longer than that. What we haven't seen any tornadoes in the years since then that are close to that length. I believe the longest in the 2011 was about 125 miles. So we've seen in the past several years tornado tracks damage surveyed that have been continuously about 125 mile path. Now that doesn't mean that we couldn't see another 200 plus mile tornado track, but it really takes pretty unique conditions to have a tornado stay on the ground that long. These thunderstorms like to cycle. They like to go into their updraft mode and then have some hail collects aloft and rain that falls to the ground and give a little bit exaggerated downdraft that sometimes will disrupt the tornado. So it is really pretty hard. We're talking way less than 1% of all the tornadoes that get tracks that are more than 100 miles continuously. So we certainly can't rule out seeing one in the future that'll be over 200 miles long, but it won't be very common. I think that's safe to say.
I was going to ask you to possibly discuss a little bit for those who maybe weren't able to join us earlier today. What are some of the contributing factors, at least in the long range, going into this winter that are contributing to the warmer side of things? I know things that might change going into the second half of winter, but what has contributed to that so far?
Yeah. Well, to summarize for those who didn't see the presentation earlier, I spoke a lot about the different indices that we looked at back in October and how those would sort of play a role going into the winter. And one of the major things that we failed on, and probably the most major thing that we failed on, was the prediction of high latitude blocking, aka the AO or the NAO index. This is probably the hardest thing to predict, but in honesty, it's probably the most important teleconnector when it comes to predicting temps in general over the lower 48 for the winter season. So pretty easy to predict. The PDO in the Pacific, pretty easy to predict. But when it comes to the NAO and the AO and Arctic blocking, very difficult to predict. So that's really where we and just about every other vendor, including the government, sort of failed on, is to be able to predict the state of the Arctic oscillation. And because of that, I mean, it's very easy to see that the NAO and the AO have been such a positive state lately. All your cold air has been bottled up over Alaska in the Arctic region, and down here we've had just a mild zonal flow. So to summarize the winter so far and where we sort of failed so far, that's pretty much it. It's the NAO is to blame. Now heading into the second half of winter, we're sort of hoping for some change. There are some indicators that we might get some sort of a sudden stratospheric warming event, which may eventually flip the state of North Atlantic and develop some more blocking later on. But that remains to be seen. We had some hints of that earlier in the winter that never panned out. So fingers crossed things will change. But right now, not holding my breath.
Okay, the next question comes from a familiar name, Dave Sweeney out in Portland, Oregon. He sent this in, actually texted it to me, and I think this one is for Dr. Forbes. What advances or improvements might we expect in tornado forecasting over the next 5 to 10 years?
Thanks, Dave. Sorry you couldn't join us. Best wishes there. Let me finish one thing about the tri-state tornado. I think I didn't mention that that's 1925, so it's been a long time since we've seen a track that long. Now, in terms of the advances, one of the things that we're seeing right now happening within the National Weather Service is the deployment of what we call dual pole radars, dual polarization. It transmits with not just a horizontal, but with a vertically oscillating beam. That may help us better confirm the existence of tornadoes by the debris signature, the negative correlation signature. It will certainly help us in severe weather forecasting to improve the hail detection, maybe fewer false alarms of severe thunderstorms for the possibility of hail, that now, just because of high return on radar, that dual pole will be able to say, no, that's mainly rain and not so much hail. Other things will happen also. With each passing year, as the computers get stronger and faster and bigger, we can put more and more factors into our predictions of the future. The computers now are capable of producing cloud scale forecasts, and as we get more and more of these remote sensing devices like the dual pole radars that may be even able to detect the droplet size and precipitation types in the storms, those can get assimilated into the numerical forecast, help predict the temperatures of the downdraft. So over periods of 10 years or so, we'll probably see numerical model prediction forecasts that will benefit from some of today's technology inputs. Satellites are improving in terms of their sensors, and one of the things that is in the works as a consequence of that, it's probably about 10 years down the road, is instead of the tornado warnings that we have right now that are based upon detection, either a spotter or a chaser or the Doppler radar has detected a tornado in progress, it will go toward some of these forecast-based, the thunderstorm resolving models and even tornado resolving models will predict that maybe there's none in progress right now, but we're going to get a supercell thunderstorm come up in the next 15 minutes and move over toward Memphis, Tennessee or some location. So the forecasts in the future may be based upon computer forecasts and probabilities of tornadoes coming your way that haven't formed yet. That would allow for bigger lead times than what we currently have. And right now, they're about 13 minutes or so on average, and for some of these big events, they've been over 20 minutes. So we're good, and we think we're going to get better.
Okay, this question is for Bruce. This is from Justin Adams. He was wondering if you do current work with the DHS IPAWS working group, and also how many radios were purchased through FEMA and Hazmat Mitigation Grant Program.
Well, there's been an ongoing purchasing process for the schools. There was about 225,000 weather radios bought in the United States for the schools, and there were about 10% of that bought in Canada, about 25,000 for the Canadian schools. But here in the United States, we are aware of the IPAWS working group, and we are in tune with what they're working towards. And the whole new RIP weather radio program, the Weather Radio Improvement Program, is being driven now at the region level in the Weather Service, and it's about to be beta tested and deployed over the next 18 months. And that will help to improve all the weather radio broadcasts around the country by putting a central focal point on weather radio in Silver Spring, Maryland, and also in the Weather Mountain in Virginia, a mirrored site, so that we'll have redundancy. Now, once that's accomplished, you'll be able to push all the NOAA Weather Radio broadcasts out to the internet. So not just 20 or 25% of the weather radio broadcasts now that are available on the internet, all of them will be available on the internet, and also for sending out text information. So there's a big paradigm shift that's coming in weather radio. It's still America's national warning system, still one of the best warning systems ever invented, even though it's 35 years old, but it's true and tried, and continues to get improved slowly. And I think because of the severity of the weather we had this year, the impetus is going to really pick up the pace on getting the Weather Radio Improvement Program finished, and then get that implemented over the next 18 months. And this new polygonal push to get that done, so that weather radio eventually can go down to the polygonal scale instead of just the countywide scale. But again, that's going to take quite a few years, and it's going to definitely increase the cost of a NOAA weather radio receiver, which is around $30 right now for a really good weather radio. You can buy for around $30, and if you put a GPS chip in it and you make it smart, I would think it'll go back to closer to 100.
Okay, and I have a follow-up to that, Bruce, and Greg, maybe you could help touch on this as well. From Mike Cox in Bristol, Tennessee, he was wondering if there's any plans or timetable for getting weather radio and sirens synced up to the warning polygons.
Well, I think he's going back to what we just spoke about. We would like to see that occur, but you have to understand that the technology is not there right now to be able to, the weather radio doesn't know it's inside a polygon. There's ability, again, on using the SAME code, which is a specific area of messaging coding, to break a county down into 1/9. So you could break a county down, but you really can't put the exact polygonal outline into a warning on weather radio until the weather radio knows where it is. And I think that's where the whole paradigm shift will occur. The big paradigm shift in weather radio was in 1999 when we brought in SAME, and that took a decade or two or actually a little more than a decade to where we are now. And now it's time to have a new paradigm shift. And there is a pilot project just been authorized by the Director of the National Weather Service, and it is taking place, about to get going, with emergency management in Madison County, Alabama, working with the local National Weather Service, WFO, in Huntsville. And we're going to see something come out of Huntsville, I bet, in the next 12 months that may be where we're going to be heading.
And I think the other part of that question involved sirens, and there, I think the siren decisions often come down to the local controlling emergency management agency. So there may be some discussions ongoing of that. I know that we had a meeting, Weather Ready Nation meeting in December in Norman, involving sociologists and emergency management and meteorologists, talking about some of the lessons learned from 2011. And some of those lessons learned were indeed that people wanted to have those very specific warnings. If you got too many county-wide warnings and it turned into be false alarms for their locations, there was a tendency to not heed them. There was also some discussion that some counties would sound sirens for a variety of things besides tornadoes, severe thunderstorms, or some were being used to alert the firemen to go report to volunteer fire departments. So there you had mixed signals that were coming out that might lead to some confusion. So I don't have the answer as to what will happen, but there may be, as a consequence of 2011 having been so bad, there may be some improvements that will happen in terms of the sirens. That said, what also got pointed out by emergency management was that the origin of the sirens was not intended to be for people indoors. It was for people outdoors. It's come to be relied upon by people indoors, but sometimes they're not so easy to hear. So backing up what Bruce has said, you need to have more than one. You don't just rely on sirens. Have NOAA Weather Radio, be alert to the weather, paying attention to the media, and so on. A lot of the people were in fact doing that. They got one warning, they'd seek another source to confirm that there really was a concern, then they would take action. We need people to be taking action immediately when they first get a warning, and so that people need to understand when they really are truly getting a tornado warning.
That's great, Greg. Thank you. I have a question here from Jonathan Brewer in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he's asking, are there more tornadic events, or are there more people trained to spot them?
Well, in reality, we don't think there's more tornadic events. If you look at the data, back in the 1950s, the number of reported tornadoes in the United States per year was about 300. It's now up in the more than 1,300 range. But those have all been essentially in an increase in the number of tornadoes that are classified in the 0 to 1, the weak tornadoes. So that is probably telling us that back in the 30s, and back in the 50s, the way the National Weather Service got reports of tornadoes was by newspaper clippings. If it made newspaper headlines, it got reported in the storm data. It had to substantially damage some buildings that way. Nowadays, with people sending in pictures to YouTube and to their television stations and so many ways that video of the tornadoes, information about tornadoes, chasers, the National Weather Service being very proactive with their emergency management partners, with the spotter networks. There are many more of the tornadoes that are being seen now than in the past. So we don't really think that the number of actual tornadoes is going up. We think that we're just seeing a much higher percentage, or recording a much higher percentage of them now than in the past.
Okay, this one is for Bruce. This is from Vincent in New Mexico. For those of us living in the continental U.S., in the 2% of the population not covered by NOAA Weather Radio, is there a way to receive warnings or improve reception of NOAA Weather Radio to get broadcasts?
Well, you can buy a external antenna if you're having trouble getting the reception. One of the problems in the state of New Mexico is that all the NOAA Weather Radio transmitters only broadcast at 100 watts. I was speaking with the National Weather Service meteorologist in charge in that state, and he's actively working with the state to get those transmitters turned to a higher wattage, because the higher the wattage broadcast, the more likely it will penetrate into your homes and businesses. Now, you can also purchase an external antenna that you can attach to any high-quality weather radio, which will basically be like taking the radio outside, and that will give you the ability to get more information in your home. So if you're having a problem receiving NOAA Weather Radio in New Mexico, I would highly recommend, first off, moving your weather radio closer to a window, taking your weather radio outside and see if the reception issue is being caused by your home and or business, and then get an external antenna, and then hopefully in New Mexico, the state will allow the National Weather Service to turn up their wattage on those transmitters, because that is a problem. I mean, if you live close to one of the transmitters, it's not, but if you live 40 or 50 miles away, it definitely cuts down the ability for that signal to penetrate the walls of your home or business and be able to activate the SAME part of your weather radio and basically tone alert you that there's maybe a problem with the weather in your area.
Okay, and Bruce, for our last question, we'll go to you, and it's from me.
Okay.
And being back here and moderating all of this social media, I was wondering how you envision NOAA Weather Radio and its usage. working in conjunction or competing with social media and how they're related?
Okay. Well, social media is a second-tiered warning device. I think it's where people go to get other information. If it's your primary way of getting warned, I think you're fooling yourself. Remember what happens when there is a disaster. The entire phone system collapses. It's not robust. Our portable devices, when there was an earthquake in Washington, D.C., the whole framework of the cellular network gets overrun with usage. People, during a disaster, it's not robust enough to be able to handle a real disaster at this point in America. So don't trust your life to a mobile device. That's what I want everybody to understand. Now, social media is a great way of getting information quick. The Weather Service is using it very well now to communicate with the media, giving a lot of times the warning coordination meteorologists at the Weather Service offices will have a briefing to the emergency management community and also to the media community to let them know that they feel that there's a large threat happening in the next 36 hours. And it's a beautiful way of communicating. But again, your base warning systems need to be something that's tried and true. Basically, television is the number one way people get weather information. NOAA Weather Radio is another strong way to get it. I do know that there are apps that are really neat out there, and I have some on my phone, and I enjoy them. But again, Weather Radio is $30, and the information is free. A smartphone is around $500, and your fees are $60 to $100 a month. Many people cannot afford that kind of cost so that they can get warned for severe weather. So it's a cost issue, and it also is a current technology issue. And right now, as far as I'm concerned, and many other people, having a NOAA Weather Radio is just like having a smoke detector in your home. It can save your whole family's life, and again, for less than $30, we recommend everybody have one.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fabulous session this afternoon here. We've gone over time a little bit, but that's because there were some extra questions. So Dr. Forbes, Bruce, and Dan, thank you so much for joining us back here today. You're actually, what's the Southwest saying? You're now free to move about the cabin. So we're going to call it quits for this afternoon, but please join us again tomorrow morning. It starts at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, and we'll start with a weather briefing from Dale Eck at the Weather Channel, and then we'll go into a buff kit presentation with Jim Ledoux from the National Weather Service, and then after that break, we'll have an actual real working workshop using buff kit and its software. So we're really looking forward to that. For those of you who are just joining us today, we have exciting events coming up on Thursday where we're going to have a panel discussion including on climate adaptation and what kind of activities need to occur around the U.S. Due to a warming climate and more adverse and heavy weather conditions. So we're going to have Eileen Shea from NOAA. We're going to have John Furlow from USAID, that's the U.S. Agency for International Development. And we're going to have also Tony Janitos, who is the director of the Global Change Research Institute, which is a joint endeavor between the University of Maryland and the Department of Energy. And then on Friday, we're going to have Dr. Jim White talk about the big changes that are happening in Greenland, alarming changes. He does a lot of research up there doing ice core analysis. And then we will also have Dr. Jennifer Francis from Rutgers University. So thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. That's it for today from Breckenridge from the Weather and Climate Summit.